to welcome a Middle Eastern journalist called Rachel Shabi, who has written on a number of the issues around the war, but particularly spoken out very eloquently against the kind of media coverage that has dominated post-Woolwich. So, Rachel Shabi.
Okay, I want to rewind a little bit. We're talking about the kind of media shutdown and government shutdown that we've seen about after Woolwich, that we're not allowed to connect it to British foreign policy in any way. But behind that is a complete disconnect to that foreign policy to begin with. So, when I work and travel around the Middle East, it's something that comes up all the time. I mean, it's in every conversation, it's unprompted, it's widespread, and it's always, about Iraq and Afghanistan, about the bloodshed, about the death tolls, about the violations of human rights, about the torture, about the imprisonment, and it's always about the hypocrisy of doing that. As though Middle Eastern life was somehow worth less than Western life. So it's at the forefront of everybody's minds in conversations in the Middle East. But here, of course, we're fighting this bloodless war, surgical strikes, now drones, less and less our deaths, less and less military invasions, and a complete disconnect to the fact that the UK is at war. And this came out a few weeks ago when Alex Thompson, the chief correspondent for Channel 4, he was horrified at a report as to how many people surveyed British people thought had died in Iraq in the decade since we invaded. And most people just got it completely wrong. I mean, anything between 100,000 and 1 million is the figure. We can't know for sure, but it's at the very, very least 100,000. 2/3 of Britain said it was 20,000 or less. 1/3 said it was 5,000 or less. And, Alex Thompson was completely horrified by this. He said that the figure is so staggeringly, mind-bogglingly at odds with the reality as to leave a journalist who worked long and hard to bring home the reality of war speechless. And it is. You look at a figure like that and you do think, as a journalist, what the hell did we do wrong? How did this very basic fact about a huge loss of life, never mind the loss of anything else, how did this get missed by the majority of the British population? So we have this complete disconnect as to what the war on terror actually does to people in the Middle East, and as to why people might not particularly like that in the Middle East. And so then, when you have a British Muslim community who cares about those issues, you get this kind of, well, what are they so angry about? Because we don't have the full picture of what people might be angry about. And I think that disconnect on an establishment level is very deliberate, because, of course, it suits governments who wage these illegal wars very well to deflect from a failed war on terror policy, to say, of course, there is no disconnection, there is no connection between our actions in the Middle East and any kind of repercussions on British soil, despite the fact that anybody who has been involved in such an act has cited precisely those events, despite the fact that Britain's own security services, as Ken just said, repeatedly warned about that possibility of domestic terror as a result of those invasions in the Middle East. But, of course, no government wants to be held to account for those illegal wars, and so there's this complete disconnect. But what that disconnect has meant is that it's turned the focus elsewhere. So if it's not to do, or if British foreign policy isn't at least a component, then what happens is that you start to, make a problem out of a community, which is exactly what's happened in Britain. Certainly post 7/7, when I would say it was pretty much government policy, the Blair government, it was pretty much their policy to make the Muslim community a problem. The whole Prevent campaign succeeded only in making Muslims suspicious and to make them fearful and to make them scared to speak out. I mean, if you have a policy whereby one of the warning signs, one of the triggers of being on this supposed conveyor belt, these are all government-sanctioned words, this supposed conveyor belt that leads inexorably to extremism when you're a Muslim. One of the warning signs of that was having undue concern about the Palestinian cause, or being unduly concerned about the Afghanistan war. So, of course, if you're going to start up with those set of premises and parameters, you're going to completely turn an entire community into a source of concern. And I do think that the British government is entirely responsible for the wave of Islamophobia that we're seeing now. It's not just the acts of far-right extremists. Those far-right extremists have been given an open door by politicians who have sanctioned and green-lighted and underpinned their behaviour. So by just creating exactly that kind of climate where that kind of sentiment can flourish, by creating a problem community and by refusing to make any connection between British foreign policy and any kind of domestic terror. What really disturbed me when I was researching this subject was the fact that has now got to the stage where many people I interviewed, British Muslims, were really scared of making that connection themselves, or at least making it out loud, for fear that they would then be labelled as, somebody that needed to be watched, somebody who was on this magic conveyor belt. That it had got to that extent where a whole community was feeling muzzled about the right to talk out loud about human rights issues in the Middle East. So I think that's why this sort of organisation is really important, because it puts a complete stop to that attempt to ghettoise any kind of concern about British policy in the Middle East. It's not a ghetto concern, it's a widespread concern. We all share it. It transcends religion and it transcends communities. And I think, it's really important to keep unified on that and to counter it together. Thank you.